as this country begins to gradually reopen this month, lots of attention has now turned to what will happen at the Canada-U.S. border. Next week, the bilateral deal that restricts non-essential travel between our two countries will expire. When asked whether that closure will be extended or those restrictions will be extended, here's what the Prime Minister had to say.
Preventing transmission from outside of Canada into Canada once we have controlled the spread within Canada will be an essential part of ensuring that we don't fall back into a second wave that could be as serious as this wave we're going through, or even more so. So we're going to be very, very careful about reopening any international travel, including the United States, before we feel that it is time.
So how are border cities feeling about any uncertainty at the border, and how much longer should non-essential travel be banned for? Drew Dilkens is the mayor of Windsor, Ontario. He joins us from that city. Hi, Mayor Dilkens. Great to have you back.
Hi, Vashi. Thanks for having me.
I want to ask you about the border, but first I want to ask you about this kind of really interesting endeavor between the U.S. consulate, the consulate general rather, and the city of Windsor, handing out 900 gift cards to Windsor area healthcare workers for their support at Detroit hospitals, or hospitals in and around Detroit. Tell me about how this came together.
Well, I've been having conversations for the last couple of months with a lot of folks across the country, and Consul General Greg Stanford from the U.S. Consulate in Toronto is someone who I've spoken to many times, and he reached out and he says, I get that the situation over there is very difficult, especially because he understands it acutely, being a Michigander by birth. And so he understands the relationship and the importance of the healthcare workers who cross each and every day, 1,600 of them, in fact, that cross each and every day from my community over to Detroit to help provide medical services over there. So he called up and he said, hey, we'd like to do something special to recognize the efforts that these folks are putting in. Can we come down and give them each a gift card as they cross the border in the morning and in the afternoon? So that's what we did today, is recognize about 900 of them who were crossing over today and just thank them for their service.
And our audience, just as you were saying that, was actually looking at a visual of you stopping cars and handing them the gift cards. What was that like? The lady who you were handing it to looked pretty surprised.
Yeah, some had anticipated it because there were some media reports ahead of time. Some had no idea who we were, and I think they thought perhaps there was a secondary inspection going on, but they were see that they were actually getting a gift, and that, you know, folks were recognizing their service. And remember, Vashi, this is not an ordinary. These folks crossing the border are not treated like ordinary healthcare professionals, because when they come home, everyone in Ontario knows what questions are when you walk into the LCBO. And there are many organizations and businesses that ask questions such as, have you been out of the country in the last 14 days? If these people answer honestly, these healthcare workers answer honestly, they are barred from going into some stores locally in the community. And so it's been an extra burden for them and their families that they tried to navigate a bit of a minefield in terms of public perception, but also the reality on the ground when they come home after work. Their life is a little more difficult than yours and mine.
That's a good point I hadn't thought of. Speaking of the border, Mayor, a lot of discussion here in Ottawa about the potential to extend, or the desire on the part of the federal government to extend the restrictions that are currently in place. They expire next week. What do you want to see?
Yeah, Vashi, I think the Prime Minister is very wise to take the approach that he's taking. I think the last thing that we want to see right now is just a grand reopening of the border. I think what needs to happen is both governments, U.S. and Canadian, need to work in harmony with business. So we see companies like Ford and FCA and General Motors start talking about ramping up production on the 18th or the 19th of May. And as that happens, there are a whole list of workers that today would not be deemed essential, but that would need to cross the border to make sure that the supply chains are functioning properly. And so not a wholesale opening of the border. I think that would be a wrong move today, but certainly making sure that the government is operating at the speed of business in a safe way. Paramount to all of this is making sure we're doing everything safe. They have to be able to operate so the staff can get back to work and make sure that they're doing it safely, but that the plants can actually function.
Let me get you, if you don't mind, to expand on that. Are you saying that essentially I shouldn't use that word, but you'd like the federal government to broaden the definition of who is an essential worker in order to allow more people to cross the border for work? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that there are a whole list of employees right now. If their businesses were closed, they haven't been allowed to cross the border, notwithstanding the fact that they may hold a work permit. And so now as the businesses reopen, we have to recognize that in order to run very complex supply chains like a Ford plant or an FCA plant and all of the tier suppliers that go into it, there are specialties that are required to cross in order to make those plants function. And so if there are barriers that stop people from being able to cross the border to service robots, as an example, that will certainly be probably the quickest path to shut the plant down. Now, I'm not advocating for a wholesale reopening. I don't think I'm ready, nor are many in my community ready just to go over to Detroit to buy gas and groceries and to do shopping. I think that's too soon. But if we can limit it and restrict it to essential workers that are necessary to get the economy going again, that would certainly indicate the government's following the speed of business and making sure that they're addressing the critical needs to make sure the supply chains can get going and that we can start ramping up the parts of the economy that are already starting on their own.
Have you had discussions with either the federal government or Premier Ford, for example, to this around this? And I ask because that agreement expires right next week.
Yeah, so we are in regular contact with our partners at the federal government. I've spoken many times to Chrystia Freeland, who's been a great asset up in Ottawa, and many others around the cabinet table as well. And so we've conveyed the message that we think that they need to operate at the speed of business, but do it in a safe way, and that a grand reopening of the border, we're not ready for that yet, but we need to be able to follow the pace of business that's important to the economy in Ontario and the economy of Canada at this particular time.
Have they been receptive so far to that?
Yeah, I think they're listening. And certainly, I understand and appreciate that I have one vantage point. I'm the mayor of a city in the the mayor of the southernmost city in Canada. And I recognize at the federal level, they have a lot of considerations that they have to make before they make big decisions like opening international borders. And so I just want to feed in, and I have been feeding in my perspective on what I see happening on the ground. And I've always had a receptive ear at the federal level for that, and I'm very appreciative.
What about with the Premier? And I'm asking because late last week, I remember very clearly Premier Ford came out and said, following a discussion with other premiers, that he was adamant he didn't want things really loosened. He wasn't specific to anything that you're talking about, but he was clear that he wanted the border to remain a hardened one, at least for the time being. Have you had any talks with him or anyone in the provincial government?
Talk very often with cabinet ministers and the provincial government. I've texted back and forth with the premier. He's been great to deal with throughout this whole thing. Amazing leadership from Premier Ford, and certainly I respect what he's saying, and I respect what the Prime Minister just said, that they don't want to see a wholesale reopening. I agree with that. But we need to make sure that the border can function for businesses in Canada and the complex supply chains that have been set up on either side. In fact, both countries and all three countries, very complex supply chains that allow people to get back to work. When I look at what's going on at Ford, for example, or Fiat Chrysler, the playbook that they have implemented to get their staff back, I don't know that there'd be a more safe place for someone to work right now besides a hospital. Incredible amount of work that's going in to make sure that their employees and their associates are really taken care of, are screened properly, and all the precautions are put in place to make sure that they're going to be safe when they go to work. So we need to be able to operate at the speed of business and make sure the border supports business as well.
I take your point on the speed of business, to be sure. What do you say to residents of your city who are worried when they watch, for example, the news south of the border? They see the spread of the virus in Michigan and other border states, and they're worried about anything that might increase the possibility of more of that coming to Canada. What do you say to those residents?
Yeah, I think I share their concern that I want to make sure we limit this and scope this down as much as possible. And that's why it's not a wholesale reopening of the border. It's not for pleasure. It's not for travel. It's merely for businesses, to support businesses that are opening. And these are businesses that they're opening under the support of provincial and federal governments. And so the border needs to function to be able to allow necessary and essential workers to be able to cross that border to service the businesses that are now being allowed to reopen.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there, Mayor. Thank you so much for your time, as always. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.